This is what I do. This is how I structure my diet. Okay, one thing that's really good that's come out of this sort of wild craze with Ozempic and Wegovy, these GLP-1 receptor agonists, is that people are at least recognizing how important satiety is. Because what researchers ultimately did with these compounds is they recognized that, wow, certain foods activate GLP-1 and it crushes the appetite. It's the natural response to certain foods, a natural response to satiety. As a matter of fact, that's why when people start going overboard in high dosages of Wegovy and Ozempic, they get nauseous. Just like if you were to overeat a bunch of olive oil on Brussels sprouts, you'd probably start to get nauseous. And the last thing you want to think about is food, right? So I'm not condoning anything one way or the other. What I'm suggesting is, yes, if we reduce our intake, we typically lose weight. There's some caveats there. Okay, insulin matters, protein intake matters, but let's just jump into the things that I would do. Now, in the beginning, these are going to be very basic things. That full disclaimer, you may want to just click off the video because you're going to be like, this is so basic, this is elementary, but they work. And they're things that I do. And I've stayed under 7-8% body fat for the better part of the last 15 years. So I think I do know something about at least manipulating, if not gaining control at least, over my appetite. So the first thing is eating slower, which bar none is so important, but I am horrible at it. So I have to consciously eat slower. I have to consciously eat slower because otherwise my appetite is going to allow me to just inhale that food. It comes from times as a kid, right? It was just like I had to eat fast. We were always on the go. It's just that way, right? And I think people develop these habits. Maybe it's dopamine issues, whatever, but eating slower. The second one is not going to be a popular one, and well, maybe it will in some categories. Caffeine. Caffeine is a tremendous appetite suppressant. Why? Because it mobilizes fat. It mobilizes fat into the bloodstream. So then from a signaling perspective, the body says, oh, we have fuel available, and you're releasing more fuel. And if you're moving, you're going to oxidize and burn that fuel. But it is a major appetite suppressant. All stimulants are appetite suppressants. There's some stimulants that I would not suggest that you go that route with, but it makes a big difference, right? Caffeine is a huge, huge appetite suppressant. So lean into it, but also don't be over the top with it. Now, the next one is one that probably sounds elementary once again, but smaller plates make a big difference. Now, this doesn't help you at restaurants, certainly doesn't, but trust me, occasionally I'll eat just off of my kids' small plates. And that makes such a big difference because your portion control is just going to reduce your calories the most. I mean, if you have that in front of you, and psychologically, it's crazy how we just want to eat whatever's right in front of us. And if I eat a full plate, that's my kid's small plate, then I'm going to feel satiated just because by sheer amount of volume on that plate, it felt like enough. The next one is kind of along the same lines. Eating your protein first not only stabilizes blood glucose and can keep the insulin levels at bay a little bit more, but consuming that protein first is going to fill you up. Protein has quite a significant GLP-1 effect, not as much as fat and fiber, but still strong, right? But it also mechanically takes more to digest. So when you eat that first, you're less likely to overconsume the fats and overconsume the carbs. Number 5, have you ever tried consuming something that just has so much olive oil on it? And you get to a point where you're like, I've had enough. Like, let's say you had vegetables and they were just drenched in olive oil. And I say drenched almost like it's a negative thing. They're just drenched in olive oil. Have you ever noticed that it's hard to overeat that? I mean, you could overeat like fettuccine with like a bunch of olive oil on it. You could probably overeat bread dipped in olive oil, but like you're talking about like veggies. Be liberal with your use of olive oil when it makes sense. Put olive oil and balsamic on vegetables. Do these things. In the interim, you may consume a little more, but you will probably consume less as the day goes on. Olive oil is a potent stimulator of GLP-1. It really is. Healthy fats, monounsaturated fats, and saturated fats are potent stimulators of GLP-1. Now, along with this olive oil, I'll also mention another type of fat. Dairy fats are very potent stimulators of GLP-1. Now, the problem that we run into with, say, cheese and things like that is cheese also is rich in what is called BCM7, beta-casomorphins. So these have an opioid-like effect when you start eating a lot of them. So cheese can be very easy to overeat. So when you're consuming dairy and you're trying to get dairy fat, I recommend going with things like maybe half and half, maybe go with whole milk, maybe go with some raw cream, maybe go with full-fat yogurt or cottage cheese. try to stay away from just overdoing the cheese, simply because it's easy to get more calories in with the cheese. Whereas if you occasionally have a glass of raw whole milk or something like that, chances are you're gonna be pretty satiated. The problem that we face is that they're very calorically dense. So you don't wanna make them a staple. You wanna make a concerted effort to say, hey, I'm gonna consume less if I have this occasionally. However, I think the olive oil is the bigger one. Now, the next one is one that's really important to note, and it kind of goes without saying, but remember that fiber is probably the strongest potential activator of GLP-1. Now, I don't think that it's just a roughage thing. I don't think that it's just the sheer volume of food. I think the impact on the microbiome plays a role. I think the impact of the prebiotic starches plays a role. I think the impact of the different species that different fibers fuel plays a role, because the bacteria in our gut become signaling devices that ultimately trigger us to either glucose metabolize better or fat oxidize better, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, it is the most potent stimulator. So when you consume things like Brussels sprouts, or you consume things like asparagus, especially if they have like some olive oil on them, you're in a great spot. And as this video goes on, you'll kind of develop a playbook of some combinations that you can do that will really, really work. I do think that an emphasis on gut health plays a role too. Remember that GLP-1s, these are gut incretins, which means that they are secreted by the gut in response to food. An unhealthy gut probably doesn't secrete as much GLP-1 or has a desensitized effect to it. So take care of your gut microbiome. So fermented higher fat dairy, vegetables, prebiotic fibers, adding in a probiotic if it makes sense for you. I don't usually recommend people lean to probiotics first, but if you're choosing a probiotic, I put a link for one down below, which is really the only one that I would recommend. I'm not a big fan of probiotics for most people or in most cases, but Seed is a bit of an exception because it's a prebiotic and a probiotic in one capsule. So it works really interestingly. So if you look at it, there's literally a capsule inside of a capsule. So when you consume it, the prebiotic fiber kind of breaks down first, and then the capsule travels down through the duodenum and into the rest of the intestinal tract and breaks down in different spaces there, potentially helping to colonize that bacteria better, which means you're getting possibly the proper staging that you need for good colonization of that bacteria to do its job. So I notice a big difference when I take Seed, especially if I'm changing my diet. So if I'm starting to, like, say, pivot to a different style of eating and I need to uniformly change my gut bacteria the best that I can, that's a good time to add it in. So making a lifestyle change, really pertinent time to focus on your gut microbiome. So that link down below is also a 25% off discount link. So 25% off the DSO1 Daily Symbiotic Prebiotic/Probiotic from Seed. So top line of the description underneath this video. The next thing is allulose. Now this is interesting. Allulose has huge data coming out on it. Tons of rodent model data, a few really strong human trials, and more coming out time after time after time. Dr. Benjamin Bickman, Dr. Andrew Kutnick, some of these guys have really done good, interesting research here. Dr. Andrew Kutnick is a type 1 diabetic too. Allulose is really interesting at modulating blood glucose because it binds or uses the same GLUT5 transporter. So it can kind of lower the effect of fructose on the body and potential fatty liver and insulin resistance, but it's a huge stimulator of GLP-1. I would even go so far as saying it is one of the most, if not the most potent natural stimulators of GLP-1. So I've used allulose literally by the spoonful to curb my appetite. I could name a bunch of different brands. This is not sponsored by any of them in any way, shape, or form. I'm a fan of RX Sugar simply because they understand the appetite side. Again, no affiliation there, just expressing ones that I use. But products that are sweetened with allulose, or even gummies that use allulose, I know it sounds like, hey, that's a processed food, I don't want to have that. No, allulose is really solid, and it's a rarer sugar that comes from like dates and figs that we normally just get in small amounts. So we're sort of just gaming the system by having a larger quantity of it or concentration of it. And trust me, and come back to me if you don't notice an appetite change, because it is seriously impactful. And I'll go so far as saying I swear by it. I notice an appetite lull for like 4 or 6 hours afterwards. Next is consolidating your carbohydrate meals to maybe 1 meal a day. Doesn't mean just eat 1 meal a day in general. Consolidate your carbs to 1 meal a day. Insulin rising and falling can manipulate your appetite. The last thing that you need is one more thing manipulating your appetite. So by consolidating carbohydrate meals to maybe lunch, it helps you out a little bit. Or if you're someone that can handle carbs at night without it affecting your sleep, even better yet is having them a few hours before bed with a relatively early dinner. The next one is one I want you to limit. Limit industrial seed oils. The evidence is clear with GLP-1. Monounsaturated fat, saturated fats, myristic acid, stearic acid, C15, these other longer chains, even MCT oil to a certain degree, as well as fiber, those stimulate GLP-1 and monounsaturated fats, of course. Polyunsaturated fats, very weak data in any support of GLP-1 activation. But when you start getting to oxidized or peroxidized fats, then it has very little effect on appetite. They're cheap, they're filler material, and they're peroxidized, which can potentially do cellular damage, but also there is some evidence there is an endocannabinoid effect. There's some early research from a particular researcher out of UC Berkeley that's talked about seed oils and their effect on endocannabinoids. They can actually stimulate appetite and make you want to eat more, but that's not always the case. It's more so just the fact that what they're combined with. Like if it's packaged, it has a barcode, it's probably going to be something that has industrialized oils in it that are not going to satiate you. So they may not make you more hungry, but they also might, but they're certainly not going to fill you up. The next one is changing how you look at artificial sweeteners. Believe it or not, I'm not opposed to artificial sweeteners. I think sucralose is the only one that has some question to it. When I was talking to Dr. Ben Bickman again, it was interesting. As someone that is really like an insulin expert, he was telling me that like aspartame and acetylsulfame potassium are not as bad as people make them out to be. Sucralose has some question marks, but aspartame is not as bad as people think. The reason that I mentioned that is that if having a diet soda curbs your appetite and you use it in a form of indulgence, I think it's okay. It's when people lean on them all the time and have them with meals, have them with these things as like a staple to their diet, that they could increase appetite, they could increase the glucose spike, they could increase the insulin spike. But if you're having it like in between meals and this is your way of reducing calories, I think it actually could work well. So position your framing as a Diet Coke or something is a period of indulgence, not a lifestyle. Next up is getting mechanistic and weird here. Salt can satisfy sweet cravings. There are these things called NST neurons in our hindbrain, a gustatory response. So in essence, when we consume sweet things, it triggers an effect that sort of activates neurons that kind of satisfy this feeling in our brain. When we are deprived of salt from a very core fundamental piece, salt is so critical for us. When we are deficient in salt, the body sends signals saying, get salt, get salt, get salt. Interestingly enough, when you have salt, it actually fires the same neurons that would fire when you had something sweet. So the point is that a lot of times when you think you're craving something sweet, you might actually be craving something salty. So don't be afraid to say, hey, I'm gonna add a pinch of salt, or I'm gonna have an electrolyte packet. I'm gonna have some salt and see if it curbs my appetite. At the very least, you could placebo your way into reducing your appetite. But the mechanistic research is there and the rodent model research is there. I don't think it's investigated a lot in humans, because most salty foods are hyperpalatable salty garbage anyway. But some pure salt and a little bit of meat or salt in your water, that could be quite powerful. The last one I'll finish with is one that's a little bit more extreme. Yohimbine / Rauwolscine. These are potent appetite suppressants. They're also stimulants. So potentially using them on days where you might succumb to temptation. Maybe you're gonna have to deal with a buffet of food, or you're gonna be on vacation, you really don't wanna splurge in the wrong way. That could be a good time to use some Yohimbine or Rauwolscine. The way that it acts upon the nervous system, it really does curb your appetite. And I don't know why it's not talked about more. It's moderately safe, and I say moderately because there's a couple random things where it's mixed with other things in the literature where maybe it could cause some tachycardia and things like that. But generally speaking, I think at a low dose, Rauwolscine is a powerful appetite suppressant, and it's a family of Yohimbine, which has been around for a long time. So don't be afraid to occasionally use those things. I would jump to something like that before I would ever recommend someone jumping on Ozempic or Wegovy first. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.